Hi and welcome back to Plastic Models by a Regular Dude and Plastic Models for Beginners. Back to basics. On to step 4 with the Tamiya cargo truck. So finished up with step 3 last time with the engine. So now we're going to flip it over, start working on some of the stuff under the bottom. So I'm going to start cutting these parts off here. Take a look what we've got. So the first parts are these mounts here for the leaf springs where they attach to the chassis, and they are pretty straightforward parts that fit on there quite nicely. So we'll put those in place, make sure they're pressed in good. And then this one here, and just a quick, whoops, I'll put it on backwards. Quick note, one of the things I like to do when I am attaching parts like this, and I'm using the method in which I don't apply the cement directly to the part and then stick it in place, is to try and use your contact point somewhere that's not going to be visible to the viewer, anybody that's looking at your model. So you wouldn't want to do it, I mean, you can, it's not that big a deal, because Tamiya extra thin doesn't really mar the finish much, but it's something I like to do. So, you know, instead of touching it down here and letting it flow around, I'll touch it up here where it's going to be pretty much hidden. Just one of those old things, you know, that you might think about, especially on larger exposed surfaces. So the next parts are 829 to those. One thing I found on leaf springs, on just about any kit I've ever built that's had them, is you're always going to end up with these parting lines running longitudinally along the part. So, you know, that's another one of those things. It can be kind of tedious. It's going to take a little cleanup. And again, I just use the old scraping method for this. You could sand it, but these parts are so small, these surfaces, that it's kind of hard to sand them. And if a person were so inclined, it's probably not really that necessary to clean this up so much, because it is going to be covered by weathering and mud and stuff like that. And generally people don't see underneath the model anyway, unless you're doing a diorama where maybe vehicle's flipped over or something. But it's always good practice just to do it anyway. I generally do. Now here's a trick, and this isn't, you know, my original trick. I've seen it elsewhere, and I've seen it recently, and I just can't remember where I've seen it people use. But whenever you clean up stuff like this, sometimes there'll be little bits of plastic and burrs and stuff that are just kind of hard to get cleaned up. You can take your Tamiya extra thin, if that's what you're using, and just kind of run it along that, and it'll dissolve that little tiny bit of burred up plastic, so it's like nice and smooth looking. So you've seen how I've cleaned this up, so I'm gonna clean these up off camera here and get them all ready. All right, these are cleaned up, so pretty easy. A couple of locating pins there, and then this part here rests up against that plate there with another locating pin. So pretty simple. Get all the contact points there. Make sure it's on there pretty good. Then do the other side. like that. All right. So this rear portion of the chassis is done. So I think the next part I'm going to cut off will be B38, which is the exhaust system. Just going to kind of work left to right here. Now the exhaust system I want to kind of be careful with because a couple of reasons. Number one, this plastic is pretty thin. You know, generally Tamiya plastic is pretty good, it's pretty durable, but you want to be careful anyway that you don't break anything. And really probably kind of want to clean up these seam lines fairly well, because even though it's up underneath the vehicle, you're going to see part of it once it's installed. So you don't want any seam lines, because this is going to be weathered pretty good. Now, weathering might cover up the seam lines, but you kind of don't want to take a chance on this. Again, I'm just using this to scrape it instead of trying to sand it. Some people find sanding easier, especially, you know, on just about everything, but stuff like this I kind of like to use the edge of the blade, just because it's easier for me to hold it. Okay. And the main thing you want to do is get the one side that's facing outward on the vehicle. Now, one other thing to look for, and it's kind of prevalent on this one, is there's some kind of weird flat spot on the exhaust right here. So you want to round that edge off. It's from the molding process, and it's kind of weird. And then there's also some flat round spots right here. You can see right there, whoops. But you want to make sure those are rounded off so they don't show up as protrusions. Later. Especially the tailpipe section, because that's a part that's going to be sticking out. Now, don't mistake a locator pin for one of these. You got a locator pin here, and then an ejector pin mark there. So you don't want to shave that locator pin off. I mean, it wouldn't be the end of the world, but it does make it a little bit easier. Now, the nice thing about this being a kit molded in '97 is by that point they were getting a little more into making sure stuff like barrels and exhaust pipes were hollowed out instead of just being straight across. So the need to drill them out wasn't as necessary. But I am going to drill this one out a little bit to thin it out around the edge, just to make it look a little more, you know, to scale. So it's just a matter of finding a bit, put it in your pin vise, one that's just slightly larger than the hole that's there, but slightly smaller than the outside diameter of your tailpipe here, and just bore it out a bit. Won't take much material out, but it will help thin it out some. Okay, so that's a little bit better. It's a little bit thinner around the edges. You don't have to worry about it being very deep down in there because you're going to put some black on there anyway, and that will... There we go. So that's a little bit better. Alright, and the nice thing about this is it's got 3 points of connection. There's the tip that goes into the exhaust manifold. There are these 2 locator pins that go onto the muffler, and then there's this locating pin here, so it's really kind of hard to mess it up. You just put it there, hold it in place, and throw down with cement on there. Like thusly. Ta-da! So we got that part on. Now next I want to, got that. It says painted XF10, which I'm sure is, that is flat brown to kind of simulate rust, but I'll do all that later. Before I start weathering, but you know, after I paint the whole vehicle the primary color. Then you also need to, just like on the one point on the front, you need to determine if you want it with the winch or without the winch. Okay, so if you're doing it without the winch, you're only putting the 2 leaf springs and this portion here, which I think is a transfer case. Or if you're doing it with the winch, you need to make sure you install this part here, which is the power supply to the, from the transfer case to the winch itself, and that's what I'm doing. So I'm going to need A26, 27, B32, and B22. So I'll cut those off and start cleaning those up. Alright, so I've got B32 and 22 cut off. So .32 fits here. And then 22 fits there and up there. So I'm going to go ahead and glue this part on first before I glue that drive line on. And looking at the detail, it's just like a drive line on a rear wheel drive vehicle. It's got U-joints there and there, so it is a drive line. Okay, so that part is glued in place. And then this one here, see if I can do this so you can see it. Oh Lord. There we go. Okay, so we got that there, and put a little dab of cement on there, push it down, make sure it is sitting flush all around because it's kind of at an angle. And then this part right here is vertical to the point where it contacts. So let's see. And I got to make sure that it's not going to interfere with the winch spool, which it doesn't look like it is. So just to test it before I cement that in. Yeah, so it'll still slide in even with that part in place. It's part of that kind of pre-planning stuff. You gotta kind of look ahead, or look behind in this case, because I was supposed to glue that in earlier. Just make sure that you'll still be able to put that part in. Put a little bit of cement there. Alright, so that takes care of that. So I'll set that aside to cure. Now I'll cut off A26 and 27, and since they are separate on both sides, I want to make sure that I, pay attention to which one's which. But it looks like it's only going to fit a certain way anyway, because this part right here on 26 fits in over here someplace, so it should be easy to keep those separated. Let's take a look. Whoops, that's B sprue. Okay, there's 27 and there's 26. 27. And I'm gonna clean that one up first and attach it and see how much difference there is between the two. So I'm gonna clean this up real quick. All right, I've went ahead and cut both of the leaf springs, A26 and 27, off because and cleaned them up because they are like mirror images of each other, so you can only put them on one way. You can't glue them on incorrectly. I mean, I guess you could, but it'd take a whole lot of effort. So I decided to cut them both off, get them cleaned up so I can install them both at the same time. Again, there's 3 contact points here, there, and there. And what you want to do is you want to make sure they're both bottomed out on this front part, because it is slightly flexible. So I'll hold it in place and get that front part glued in there. Like that. Make sure it's bottomed out in that little notch, a little cutout, and then get this back part here. Make sure it's in place nicely, and then glue the center portion, but I'm going to do that from the inside here where this contact point is, where the seam is. Make sure that's pressed in nicely, and then do the same thing with this one. Nice thing is, it kind of these parts are engineered and molded in such a way that they pretty much just sit in there once you put them in place. One of the benefits of Tamiya kits is the is the way they fit. They fit so well that it just makes it so much easier to attach, assemble all these parts. That's voila. So step 4 is complete. All right, the next part is step 5, and that is the transfer case, fuel tank, brake drums. So let's start with B10 and 11, which are the parts for the transfer case. See, it's kind of nice that they glued these, or they molded along this edge here, so you maintain this little ridge around here. Sometimes the sprue gate will be on up into this part here, and it just makes it a lot harder to clean up, especially if it's something that's going to be exposed, which this isn't really necessarily going to be exposed, but it's just nice that, people making these molds actually think of that kind of stuff. Got a little bit of flash here, and that's pretty good. All right. Alright, so we got some locator pins and holes. I'll make that easy to glue together. Again, when you're holding stuff like this, make sure you're not holding where your cement is going to be, so you don't get any fingerprints. Those can be a real nightmare to try and repair. Okay, so we got that. Alright, so B17, 16, 39, and 12 comprise all of the pieces for the fuel tank. So I'm going to chop all those off. Get those cleaned up. Now these are the ends to the fuel cans, so this is one of those places where I'm gonna, as I showed in an earlier step, buzz off these kind of raised sharp corners so it doesn't look funny when it comes time for weathering. And then make sure those sprue gates are nice and smoothed out. And if you want to learn the nomenclature for plastic model parts, as far as you know, what parts are called sprues and runners and sprue gates and all that kind of crazy stuff, there is a YouTube channel called International British Modeler. His name's Martin, and he's an engineer, and he does this kind of stuff for a living, apparently. And he has a really good, on a recent video of his, I think it was recent, he does a really nice job of explaining what all the various parts of this that comes out of the mold. He explains how the mold is done, he explains why they do some parts of molding, and he poses questions as to why they wouldn't do certain things when it would be much easier, not only easier, but make the part a little more user-friendly. So again, it is International British Modeler, and he's a good modeler. He's got some really good stuff. He's got some aircraft he's done recently over the last, you know, year or two or whatever that are just, man, they look really good. He does a really nice job explaining how he's doing things and all that kind of stuff. So if you get a chance, check out his channel. It's really good. So here are the parts. Now this one, it's got some stuff that needs to be cleaned up, but I think I'm going to do that after I get this all together. That way I know what needs to be cleaned up. Now this is a case where you want to make sure, you know, there's not much slop in the pins, the locator pins and holes, but you want to make sure that they're lined up pretty good. And make sure you put an adequate amount of cement. I like, on parts like this, I like to put some on the inside. Excuse me. And a little bit on the outside to really seal that seam up, because it's supposed to be a rounded edge from the manufacturing process of the fuel tank. So you don't want a seam there whenever you're done. So by doing this, you really fill that in. If you squeeze it together, it'll really bond the plastic, and that way when you sand it smooth, it will indeed be smooth, and there won't be even a faint hint of a seam line. So I'm going to let that cure up for a minute. As a matter of fact, since I want it to be nice and seam free, I'm going to clamp it together, just not too tight, just enough to hold it snugly in place. Because you can see a faint bit of a seam line, and when I get done I want that to be perfectly smooth, like these opposite edges here where it's not cemented together. So I'm going to put that right there and let that dry up, and in the meantime I will work on these brake drums. Okay, and here's something that's kind of nice, and here's something why it's it's a good idea to read this stuff. You got your brake drum, 2 pieces of A23 included. Okay, so what are they telling you to do here? Well, use A23 instead of 31 for removed wheels. So like if you were modeling a truck that was having a wheel change, for instance, you would use this part instead of this part. That way when you have it on the kit, it looks realistic. It looks like a brake drum instead of just, where the wheel glues on. So that's kind of nice, and that's where it's important that you make sure that you read these little notes here so you know what's going on. So I'm going to start cutting these parts out. Now I'm not going to be using A23. I'm going to save them for the spares box though. So I'm going to cut out all these parts real quick. All right. All those parts are cleaned up, cut off and cleaned up, and you're supposed to do a total of 6, as it indicates right here, make 6. And you got 2 of those if you want to use them. So you could have two wheels being repaired. So again, I'm just applying the cement at the seam line. Like that. Alright, fuel cans had time to cure up. And the nice thing is that these seams are on the lower edge, as it would be sitting on the vehicle, and the back edge up underneath the truck. So even if you don't get it cleaned up perfectly well, you're not going to see them anyway, so it's kind of nice. But it doesn't take much to clean them up, so that's what I'm doing. Okay, and then the ends, glue those in place. And it's nice because they made these ends seam right along these mounting points, like mounting brackets or whatever they are. So it kind of helps make things look a little neater with less cleanup. Very thoughtful. Very thoughtful of Tamiya to do that for us. Alright, and then the last part for the fuel can, or for the fuel tank, is the, and I just saw it, B39, which is the fill spout. There it is, way over there, all tiny. Cut that off, just make sure this gets cleaned off nicely. And then that plops right in there, and that's a nice snug fit, so it'll look like it's firmly affixed. Yeah, see, the cement went all around there real nice. All right. So, transfer case, fuel can, or fuel tank, and the brake drums. So that takes care of steps 4 and 5. So in order not to make this video way too long like the last one, I'm going to call it quits here, and we'll come back next time to step 6, which is the driveline assembly on into putting all that onto the chassis. Then it'll be onto the wheels. So we'll call it quits there. Again, thanks for joining me here on Plastic Models by a Regular Dude and Plastic Models for Beginners, Back to Basics, with the Tamiya cargo truck. So if you have any questions, comments, put them down below as always, and I will see you all next time.